How many rounds that were in that holster did you suspect were live?
One.
And I'm just hanging out with him because, yeah, he's the one who pulled the trigger.
The defendant didn't do a gun safety check with that inexperienced armorer. He pointed the gun at another human being, cocked the hammer, and pulled that trigger in reckless disregard for Ms. Hutchins' safety.
Even if he intentionally pulled the trigger like the prosecutor just demonstrated, that doesn't make him guilty of homicide.
Day one of the Alec Baldwin trial has wrapped up, and we're going to bring you everything you need to know about what happened in that courtroom. From opening statements to the first witnesses called in the case, we break it all down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Day one of the New Mexico criminal trial of Alec Baldwin has wrapped up, and a lot happened in that courtroom. The jury of 11 women, 5 men, heard opening statements, witnesses. We're going to recap what you might have missed and what the arguments are, why everything might be relevant to the jury. Now, in this case, we're talking about how the A-list actor is facing an involuntary manslaughter charge for the 2021 shooting death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins on the set of the movie Rust. This was when a prop gun held by Alec Baldwin went off. And it turns out there was a live round in that weapon. The bullet hit Halyna Hutchins. It also hit director Joel Souza in the shoulder. He survived. Halyna tragically did not. And this is such a terrible, terrible incident that should not have happened. I say that so many times. This should not have happened. And the question, of course, becomes, who's at fault? Well, the armorer in this case, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, she was already convicted of her own involuntary manslaughter charge. She was sentenced to the maximum of 18 months in prison. The idea there, she failed to load and check the gun properly that day. And Baldwin now faces potentially the same fate for his alleged role, because the prosecution is reportedly arguing 2 different theories of involuntary manslaughter. That Alec Baldwin is guilty of involuntary manslaughter because either he acted negligently when using the firearm, or he acted without due caution or circumspection, showing a total disregard or indifference for the safety of others. Now, to better understand that point, here is Erlinda Johnson, one of the prosecutors in this case, day one of the trial, remember, delivering the opening statement for the state. Now, remember, openings are a preview of what will be presented to the jury. They are summarizing each side's position as we move forward in the trial. They're not evidence per se, but they are very important nonetheless.
When someone plays make-believe with a real gun in a real-life workplace, and while playing make-believe with that gun violates the cardinal rules of firearm safety, people's lives are endangered, and someone could be killed. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what this case is about. The defendant handled this firearm multiple occasions. You will see video footage of the defendant firing this firearm, working perfectly fine. But you'll see evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that each time the defendant handled this firearm, he did not do a safety check with that inexperienced armorer. And you'll hear that the reason he didn't do a safety check is because he didn't want to offend her. The evidence you will see will paint a real-life picture of a real-life workplace where this defendant mishandled this gun. You will see him using this gun as a pointer to point at people, to point at things. You will see him cock the hammer when he's not supposed to cock the hammer. You will see him put his finger on the trigger when his finger's not supposed to be on the trigger. You will hear about numerous breaches of firearm safety with this defendant and this use of this firearm. The evidence will show that on October 21st, 2021, after that lunch break, the defendant once again violated those set safety rules. And during this blocking, The director had instructed him to just slowly take out that gun and just hold it at an angle. But you will see that the defendant takes it out quickly the first time, points it. And you will hear witness testimony who will tell you the first time he does it, his finger is on or around the trigger. The defendant didn't do a gun safety check with that inexperienced armorer. He pointed the gun at another human being, cocked the hammer, and pulled that trigger.
In other words, we will show you why Alec Baldwin is criminally responsible in how he used that weapon. That not only did he pull the trigger, but we will show you a pattern of him acting recklessly with the weapon. And he should have known better. He should have checked the weapon, especially because, in their argument, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was such an inexperienced armorer. And the prosecution is saying, we will prove to you that Alec Baldwin pulled that trigger, despite him saying he didn't, and that this wasn't a case of a mechanical failure where the gun went off.
The evidence will show that meanwhile, after the shooting, the defendant began to claim he didn't pull the trigger. The evidence will show, ladies and gentlemen, that's not possible. You will hear from Mr. Pieta himself, who will tell you that gun will not discharge without a pull of the trigger. You will hear from firearms experts who will tell you that gun will not discharge without a pull of that trigger. And in fact, you'll hear evidence that the defendant himself admitted in December of 2021 that this gun didn't have any mechanical problems.
Okay, so that was the prosecution. Here is now the defense, and this is defense attorney Alex Spiro for Alec Baldwin.
You will hear no evidence, not one word, that Alec Baldwin had anything to do with that real bullet being brought onto that set. It is undisputed that the bullet was loaded into the gun by the armorer, the person on set whose responsibility it was to ensure the gun was safe. The first assistant director's job, the head of safety, Dave Halls, checks it before it goes to the actor. And he will tell you he made a tragic mistake. He failed to detect a live bullet. And Alec Baldwin had nothing to do with that either. The prop gun was placed in Mr. Baldwin's hands and cold gun was announced, meaning it had been checked and double-checked by those responsible to ensure the gun was safe. It was just a prop. They all thought it was just a prop and could do no harm. The actor's job is to act, to rehearse, to choreograph his moves, to memorize his lines. He's Harlan Rust. He's an outlaw running for his life, who in the incident in question, he's pulling a six-shooter to try to defend himself. That's why the gun has to be safe before it gets into the actor's hands. His mind is somewhere else, in the being of another, a century away, an outlaw. He must be able to take that weapon and use it as the person he's acting would. To wave it, to point it, to pull the trigger like actors do. For acting to work, you have to be so close to the barrier of real and imagined that the viewer feels that they're there, that it's real. The SAG guidelines don't tell actors to check the gun. You will see them. That's not the actor's role. Alec committed no homicide. On a movie set, you're allowed to pull the trigger. So even if he intentionally pulled the trigger like the prosecutor just demonstrated, that doesn't make him guilty of homicide.
By the way, right now for this episode, this is more of just kind of a synopsis of the opening statements. We did a previous episode of Sidebar where we listed out in more detail the 15 things from the opening statements that we caught. So if you want a more full-depth analysis and more of what was said in those opening statements, you could check out that episode. But few things to talk about here with Alex Spiro and what he said. The basic argument here is that Alec Baldwin is not responsible for loading the gun. He didn't put a live round in it. It's not his job to check the gun. He had every reason to believe it was safe when the armorer and the assistant director, Dave Halls, who took a plea in this case, they were the ones who checked the gun. Baldwin, he was focused on his job. He is the character of Harlan Rust. He needs to concentrate. He can't worry about firearms. He's in the zone. And you know what? He's allowed to fire the weapon, to wave it, to use it, to point it. That's the job of an actor in a Western film. And the defense also pointed out one more piece of information that is very important in this case.
They proceed with the destructive test. They eliminate the one item that could prove what Alec said and believed. They didn't offer him a chance to test the gun. They didn't take the gun apart before they broke it and destroyed it and look at its inner workings. They didn't turn on their videotape. They just destroyed it. Can't ever be tested in the same condition it was in that day. Won't ever allow Alec to show his truth.
Hey everybody, I just want to take a quick second to thank Upside for sponsoring this episode of Sidebar. So Upside is a free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, dining. Now believe it or not, I do know how to pump my own gas. I don't know if that was controversial or not, but when I do, I can use the Upside app. Why not get cash back when you fill up your tank, right? And yes, this is actual, real cash back. No confusing rewards or points or credits, just actual money you can transfer straight to your bank account. So once you have the app, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. You pay as usual using a debit or credit card, and you follow the steps on the app and you get paid. And as you just saw me do, you can use Upside at places like, Shell, Exxon, Mobil, 7-Eleven, Sunoco, restaurants like Chipotle, Papa John's, Dairy Queen, Domino's, KFC, Taco Bell. That's just to name a few. Now to find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen and use our promo code SIDEBAR and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's promo code SIDEBAR for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. Yes, the gun was tested by the FBI, parts of it were destroyed, so the defense says we can't properly analyze it. How do we determine if the gun malfunctioned or not? How do we know for sure if maybe the gun just went off? We don't know because the government destroyed it. So that's a very big piece of information, and I imagine a big point of contention in this case and a big argument for the defense. But after the opening statements, now we're going to talk about witness testimony. So the prosecution, they go first, right? They start presenting their witnesses. It's their case to present. They have the burden of proof here. And first up, we have Nicholas LaFleur. This is a former Santa Fe County deputy. He was the first person to arrive on that scene at the movie set. Now, some of LaFleur's body cam was played for the jury, and I want you to listen carefully to what is said.
Okay, who else?
Reed Russell was here. Alec Baldwin was the actor on set that pulled the trigger.
Alec Baldwin?
Yes, sir.
How's it going, sir? So my understanding, you were in the room when someone was shot?
Holding the gun, yeah.
Okay, alrighty.
What do you need?
Well, I know your name, so let me get with my lieutenant and see where we want you to hang out, okay?
Whatever you want to do.
Yes, sir. All right, give me just a second. You want to pull the trigger? Do you want me to have him sit tight or?
All right. So try to keep him away from everybody.
Okay. Have him
Talk to anybody.
Okay.
So aside from the fact that you have someone at the church where this shooting happened say to officers that Baldwin pulled the trigger, and that of course could just be the person assuming this happened, and aside from seeing Baldwin's immediate reaction, another important issue is that LaFleur was instructed to keep the witnesses separated, but watch what happens.
And then they cleared the gun outside after his request, and I witnessed them clear it and saw the bullets.
Okay. So
Only one was.
The one that was missing, the one that was fired, we don't know, but all the other ones were proper.
They had loads.
Officer LaFleur, does it seem to you right now that they're talking about the incident?
Seems like they're talking about the gun that was used in the incident.
There's basically a lot of it's a blank, but because I think it was based on the sound and how much ringing I had, I think it was a half.
Officer, are they still talking about the incident?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there a reason that you didn't stop them since you told them not to?
I think as time goes on, I tell them to stop.
Officer LaFleur, does it look like Mr. Baldwin is speaking to a potential witness?
He just looks like he's talking to the guy who says his name is one of the directors, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So the idea that's seemingly put forward by the prosecution is that you have witnesses talking to each other at a very important time. That Baldwin is possibly coordinating his story or crafting his story with others based on what other people are saying, or at the very least, their stories are being contaminated. And that is why in investigations you want to segregate witnesses to hear their independent recollections of what happened, especially so there's no influence from others. And the idea here put forward by the prosecution is that Baldwin was disobeying orders to not talk to others. But I will tell you, it was made clear in testimony that this officer didn't really tell them to stop immediately and didn't segregate them. Now, the defense, they jumped on this too in cross-examination, but in a different way.
Also in that video, you can see a lot of these people are coming over to Mr. Baldwin, right?
Yes.
One of them comes over and shakes his hand, right?
Yes.
Have you ever seen that in all of your experience? Somebody commit a homicide and everybody and all the witnesses are on the scene, circling around the person, shaking his hand and talking to him about what happened. Have you ever seen that in your entire career?
No.
He wasn't under arrest, right?
Not to my knowledge, no.
From there, we move on to the testimony of Tim Benavides, a retired lieutenant from the Santa Fe Sheriff's Office, and he too responded to the scene. And he made contact with the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, on scene and actually inspected the weapon in question.
Did you do anything with this gun? Open the cylinder, or anything at all once you received it from Ms. Gutierrez?
Yes, as soon as I got to my unit, I opened up the cylinder and I made it safe for myself and whoever else was going to handle it.
And when you say you made it safe, what do you mean by that?
I opened up the cylinder on this wheel gun and I ran the wheel to make sure there was no rounds in it.
And were there any rounds in it?
There was no rounds in it.
Did you do anything else to the gun?
I did not.
Okay. To your knowledge, did anybody else have access to this gun once you put it in your patrol vehicle?
No.
So he was the one who declared this crime scene, retrieves the revolver so it can be put into evidence. But he does acknowledge that he didn't wear gloves and maybe take certain other precautions that we would see in another kind of case. So one of the things highlighted by the defense is the potential sloppiness of this investigation, right? So we already have officers who didn't segregate the witnesses. Now maybe the way that evidence was collected was problematic. It's a very common argument we see in criminal cases. Okay, but moving on from there, we then heard from Deputy Joseph Lujan, also from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office. So he went to the hospital where Joel Souza was. And remember, Joel Souza was shot in the shoulder, and he recovered another key piece of evidence in this case.
Okay. What did you observe when you walked into the trauma room?
A gentleman sitting on or laying on like a gurney, hospital bed type thing, in the upright position. He had an approximate half-inch hole to, I believe it was the right side of his shoulder.
Do you remember his name?
Yes, it was Mr. Joel Souza. I observed medical doctors administer some sort of medication to him, and then they retrieved a projectile from his shoulder.
And what happened to that projectile once it was taken out of Mr. Souza's shoulder?
It was placed into a plastic container. It was handed to me and I kept possession of it.
Now, he said he met with Souza to obtain some preliminary information from him. And there is something about what Souza didn't say that the defense really honed in on.
I think you told the prosecutor you briefly made contact with him to get some preliminary facts.
Yes, sir.
And he was willing to speak to you, right?
Yes, sir.
And he never once mentioned Alec Baldwin, did he?
Objection, calls for hearsay.
He never, in describing the preliminary facts to you, ever mentioned Alec Baldwin, correct? Correct.
Again, goes to the argument that no one believed Alec Baldwin was at fault or committed a crime, that this was purely an accident, and perhaps someone else other than Alec Baldwin is to blame for how this shooting happened, especially from the guy who got shot, right? Wouldn't he turn around and go after Alec Baldwin? He shot me, he shot me. But you don't really hear that here, at least according to this testimony. And finally, let's talk about the testimony of Marissa Popple, crime scene technician. She discovered live rounds on the movie set.
And when you collected all of this ammunition, you took it back to the sheriff's department.
Yes.
And at some point, did you examine closely all of the ammunition?
Yes.
And did you develop any suspicions?
Yes.
What suspicions did you develop?
There were several rounds that, when shaken, did not make the rattle noise, and they all had a silver in color primer at the end instead of a brass colored primer.
And did the primer appear to be intact?
Yes.
And did those have a hole in the side?
No.
You indicated that you had some suspicions about them. What was your suspicion?
My suspicion was that they were live rounds.
And what are we looking at there?
These were 2 boxes of ammunition that were inside of Lieutenant Benavidez's unit.
And were there any rounds inside that box that you suspected to be live rounds?
Yes.
How many?
1. There was a gun holster, just 1 inside the church.
The ammunition that was inside of that holster, did you closely examine it?
Yes.
And did any of that was in the holster cause you to suspect that there were any live rounds in the holster?
Yes.
Such important testimony, such an important witness. But I will tell you, this is arguably worse evidence for Hannah Gutierrez-Reed than it was for Alec Baldwin, that there were live rounds on that set. He wasn't the one to bring those live rounds onto the set. No one has ever suggested that. And I mean, of course, you know it was worse for her because she was convicted. And part of the reason she was convicted was for not ensuring a safe environment. And the evidence came out that maybe she was the one who brought the live rounds onto set and loaded the live round into that gun. But what does this testimony also do? It gives the jurors a sense of what was happening there and whether Alec Baldwin contributed in any way to the unsafe nature of that set, or should have known that the set was unsafe, or should have known something was wrong, and especially with such an inexperienced armorer, that should he have done more to make sure the gun was safe before he allegedly fired it? That's what we're going to see being put forward in this case. But there you have it. That is day 1 of Alec Baldwin's trial out of New Mexico, his manslaughter trial. It wrapped up. We will continue to follow this trial as it develops. Stay with us here on Sidebar. In the meantime, that's all we have for you right now. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.